Hello and welcome to the IEP Live Learn Lunch. It's our 64th Live Learn Lunch, I believe it is, and we're really excited today to be joined with by Alice Archer from Chronically Consulting, who is going to take us through today's session. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Alice for today's session. Over to you, Alice.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Helen. Right, if you just bear with me a moment, I am going to share my screen. So just let me get this set up correctly. Okay.
Great, we can see that.
Great. Oh.
Symptoms.
Hang on, sorry, it's gone. I'm going to have to go back and start this again. Bear with me. It's always the way, isn't it?
It is always the way. Don't worry at all.
From beginning. There we go. Right, hopefully everybody can now see my welcome slide.
Perfect.
Excellent. So, as I said, thank you for joining us today. My name is Alice Archer, joining you today from Chronically Consulting. I'm going to be presenting a session on understanding Emmy in the workplace and in employability. So hopefully if you're here today, you are somebody who works in employability or maybe as a manager or just wants to know a bit more about supporting people with Emmy in the workplace and employability. Just a little bit of housekeeping up front. So obviously I'm going to be presenting to you today in PowerPoint. We are going to be using a few interactive sections of the presentation today. I would just ask if you have questions, please do keep them for the kind of questions sections, just because I'm not able to monitor the chat as the session goes on, and it's a little bit easier if they're all in one place. But I will be asking you some questions throughout the session, so please do use the chat function to respond to those. And Helen, if you could help me in managing that, that would be great. We're also going to be doing some polls as well at some point. So when there will be polls, they should appear on your screen as a pop-up with yes, no answers. If you do struggle with that, please just do put a yes or no in the chat. So I'm just going to do a really quick disclaimer. So I'm going to be talking today from my own personal and professional experiences of having Emmy and advising people with Emmy. However, this is not reflective of everyone with Emmy, and others' experiences will differ from my own. I'm not a solicitor, and none of what I'm presenting today is legal advice, and the views expressed in this training are my own and are not reflective of the Institute of Employability Professionals or any other organisation. So a little bit about me. So I was diagnosed with Emmy at the age of 17, and I'm now living with multiple chronic illnesses. I worked as an employment advisor for local and national charities and have done for the last 7 years. And in 2020, I started Chronically Consulting, an organisation specialising in chronic illness, disability and employment issues. It really comes from my experience of going through disability discrimination in the workplace shortly after I was diagnosed, when I was still a teenager and kind of starting out in the world. And it's really shaped my career and led me into working into the disability employment support field. So the objectives of today's session are going to be to find out, to learn about what ME is and also the link with long COVID. We're going to be finding out about how the condition is managed, because that does have an impact on managing it in the workplace. We're going to be exploring the adjustments needed in employability and the workplace, and I'm going to be directing you towards further resources if they are needed. So what I want to do first is find out how much do you all already know. I'm going to ask some questions, and Helen, I can't actually see the chat, so you might have to tell me what is going on in the chat when I'm asking these questions.
Absolutely fine, I can do that.
Thank you. I will just say there are no wrong answers. I just want to find out what is the kind of level of knowledge that's out there amongst you guys at the moment. So I'm going to put the questions on the screen one at a time, and I just like you to type what you think the answer is in the chat. So the first one is, how many people in the UK are estimated to be living with ME? And just a hint, if you read the article that was put out by the IEP ahead of this session earlier this week, then the answer may have been contained within that article.
We've had a 312,000 and a 1 million so far.
Okay.
260,000, 400,000.
Okay,
1.5 million, 200,000.
Okay, so quite actually a few answers within the right sort of range there. So it is estimated that there are around 250,000 people living with Emmy in the UK. Now that is just an estimate, and that can be a little bit tricky to estimate in terms of how the condition is diagnosed, which I'm going to come on to a little bit later. That figure also has not been updated in a few years, so obviously things may have changed in the last few years in terms of the pandemic, but yeah, that's the current estimate in the UK. Next question, what do you think causes Emmy?
This may take a little longer for people to pop that in the chat.
That's okay. Don't worry, I'm not expecting a scientific thesis on this. Just from what you have heard, what do you believe causes ME?
We've had trauma, we've had anything, viral infections, autoimmune conditions, life changes, traumatic events, immune system. Someone said after glandular fever they were diagnosed. It possibly is genetic. Lots of different suggestions there.
Okay, yeah, interesting. So yeah, a lot of people are correct. So it is often thought to be triggered by a viral infection. However, there are other causes of the condition that are still being investigated. Ultimately, they don't really 100% know what does cause it, but a lot of cases do seem to be following a viral infection. As somebody mentioned, glandular fever, so that's a really common one. Epstein-Barr virus and other similar kind of viruses can also be other viral infections that do cause seem to go on to cause ME. What are the symptoms? Again, I know there's a bit of typing involved with this one, but just, you know, if you were going to list 2 or 3, what would you say the main symptoms of the condition would be?
We've had a fatigue, tiredness that doesn't go away with rest, brain fog, severe fatigue, some more brain fog coming through there, muscle weakness as well.
Yeah, so people... I mean, it sounds like there's already quite a lot of knowledge out there, which is really good. So, you know, the most common symptoms do tend to be fatigue, pain, concentration difficulties, post-exertional malaise, which I'm going to talk about in a little while, concentration and memory issues, recurrent viral infections are just some of the symptoms, but there are many more possible symptoms with the condition. By the way, all of these figures and facts come from actionforme.org.uk. They're one of the charities for ME based in the UK. So what is ME slash CFS? Now I have included the slash CFS here. I don't tend to use CFS personally. I tend to use the ME label. I'll talk a little bit first about the difference. So ME stands for myalgic encephalomyelitis, with myalgic meaning pain, and encephalomyelitis essentially means inflammation of the spinal cord. So the label means it's a condition that it involves pain and inflammation of the spinal cord. CFS stands for chronic fatigue syndrome. I tend to avoid that label just because I don't feel that it's accurate or reflective. People tend to think that just means that you feel a bit tired. It's much more than feeling just a bit tired. So it is a neurological condition, and it is more than feeling tired. So the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, also known as NICE, acknowledges that the physical symptoms of ME can be as disabling as MS, systematic lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, congestive heart failure, or other chronic conditions that we tend to think of as being more disabling. The symptoms cover a wide and varied range, but the most common ones are pain, fatigue, concentration problems, also known as brain fog, which somebody mentioned earlier in the chat, post-exertional malaise. And our post-exertional malaise is a worsening of symptoms even after a small amount of activity. So it doesn't mean that somebody has to do a lot of activity before their symptoms come worse. It could even be something as simple as taking a shower in the morning could make your symptoms worse. So it is invisible and fluctuating, which means that the symptoms can change quickly and over a great range without any outward indication of doing so. And there are several severities of the condition which are recognised in the NICE guidelines. So the NICE guidelines recognise mild, moderate and severe ME by different criteria. So people with mild ME are often able to be a bit more mobile and carry out some physical activities, but that doesn't mean that they don't experience symptoms. People with moderate ME may have reduced mobility and be less able to carry out daily living activities. And then the third category, people with severe ME, who are much more likely to be bedbound, housebound, and require assistance with a range of different daily living activities. So, what does it feel like to have ME? Well, again, this is just from my own experience, but I would describe it as feeling waking up and feeling unrested, which again somebody mentioned earlier. So having a fatigue that doesn't go away with rest, sometimes waking up in the morning feeling like you've just run a marathon rather than having 8 hours of sleep. Thinking through treacle is one way that I describe that kind of brain fog feeling. So having that real difficulty in concentrating and really struggling with being able to form your thoughts and find words. You might notice as this presentation goes on, I might start to do things a little bit like lose my words or struggle with my voice. So that's the kind of effects of this sort of brain fog coming into effect, essentially. Like your nerves are on fire. So that's with the kind of pain symptom that we're talking about. And bearing in mind, we did talk about that inflammation of the spinal cord, although they haven't necessarily pinpointed exactly what causes that pain-like symptom. It very often can feel like, to me, like my nerves are on fire. No energy to move or do simple tasks. So when my fatigue is really bad or when I have a viral infection, there's not really a lot I can do about it. I just have to sit back and rest until that passes. And bearing in mind, I am someone who nowadays has a mild form of the condition. So all of these things are still things that even somebody with a mild form of ME experiences. So what I would like to know in the chat is, what is a stereotype that you have heard or encountered about ME? Now, this doesn't have to be something that you believe, but just it could be something that maybe you have seen in the media, represented on television or in newspapers. What are the kind of stereotypes that come to mind when you think about ME? I just want you to put a few words or a short sentence in the chat of what have you heard in the general public.
While we're waiting for people to do that, Alice, we've had a really interesting comment from Sally, who says she's attended a session recently where they, instead of using the terminology of fatigue, they use the terminology of energy impairment.
Yes.
Because found that fatigue people think can be sorted with a bit of rest, whereas energy impairment people tend to relate to that differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that is some very good, that's as the result of a very good report that was recently put out by the Chronic Illness Inclusion Project with Catherine Hale, who I believe is actually here today. I'm going to be referencing that report a bit later on. And yes, you're absolutely right. Energy limiting illness is a term that's being increasingly used. I wanted to stick today with some of the more familiar terminology for people, just because we're obviously introducing people to it, but definitely energy limiting impairment is a term I would also use to describe it.
Excellent, thank you. So we're getting lots of stereotypes through now.
Okay.
So you just need more rest, or that you're a wheelchair user, that it's a form of depression, that the individual might lack motivation, and people say pull yourself together and get on with it. Yeah, a message from Catherine as well, waving, saying thanks for bringing up energy impairment. Our pleasure, Catherine, and thank you for attending the session if you're involved in the report, so we can get your thoughts later as well.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, and I am going to be linking to that report at the end, as it's been, you know, I've read it myself and just kind of it encapsulated so many things that I've encountered both personally and as an employment advisor over the years. So I will talk about it a bit later. So yeah, you're absolutely right in terms of the stereotypes and the things that people have heard in the media or in the public about Emmy. We tend to encounter this stereotype of people being lazy, people being unmotivated, people just not wanting to do things, or that it's something you can literally pull yourself out of, and it's really not. If you think about the fact that 250,000 people in the UK are estimated to have this condition, and the way in which it affects people, it's not a thing that people are choosing to do. So what I wanted to do is have a little examination of what the stigmas and the stereotypes are around ME, and you know how that's come to be the case, why people think of it in this way. So hopefully you'll be able to see on the screen now this kind of circular 4-part diagram, and this is my encapsulation of what the stigmas are around ME and kind of how they're formed and how they keep going around. So we're going to start in the top left hand quarter with the lack of research and the lack of testing, the belief that the condition is psychiatric and psychosomatic, and this is something that very much comes from the science and also from the medical profession as well. For a long time, people did believe that ME was a psychiatric or a psychosomatic condition, that it wasn't real, and that people were making up their symptoms. I will come on to talk a little bit later about the lack of research into ME, but the fact that there essentially hasn't been a lot of research into it has really fueled this belief in the medical profession that it is something that people have made up. If we look at how this is interpreted by the media in the 80s and 90s, you might have seen headlines declaring things like yuppie flu or shirker syndrome, characterizing people that have ME as being lazy, and also because it's a condition that primarily affects women, there's also been a great gender bias in the reporting around it. So a study in 2019 found that a significant gender bias in the reporting of ME in English newspaper articles. So it found that women with the condition were presented as being more emotionally distressed, with their physical symptoms being minimized and the emphasis put on how it had affected them at home, whereas men who had the condition were portrayed as being action men prior to their diagnosis, with physical symptoms being prominent and their impact on their career and sport being emphasized. So we also have to think about how that plays into the kind of general patriarchy of how women are portrayed in society. We then move on into the bottom right-hand quarter of how this fuels as well a lack of belief from other professionals. Now, I'm including within this the social care sector, the benefit system, and just the difficulty in getting evidence that you are actually ill. Unfortunately, again, referring back to Catherine's report, you find that a lot of people with ME tend to be stuck in between the benefit system and the world of work without really being able to access either of them very effectively. And so all of these things together have led to this public perception that ME is just people who are lazy, that it's all in your head, and that you should try to exercise more or try yoga. So that's just my interpretation of where this kind of stigma of ME comes from. But what are we doing about it? So there have been a lot more developments in science and Emmy research, particularly over the last 10 years. And I'm actually hoping that it's something that, the emergence of long COVID will actually contribute to as well, because of the similarities between the two. So there has been research that has been looking into the biomarkers of ME, including things that could show up in brain imaging, blood tests, psychological tests, saliva testing, and urine testing. These are all being explored as options, but none of them has yet come up with a single biomarker or set of biomarkers that is unique to people with ME. So that is still being explored as a potential option for diagnosis. There is also currently a study that is recruiting at the moment called Decode ME, which is the largest ever biomedical study of ME taking place. So they haven't necessarily established a genetic link for ME currently, but they are looking at the differences of people with ME as a part of this study to establish if there are any genetic factors that may contribute to somebody going on to develop the condition. But this is what we have in terms of ME science. Now, in terms of the current methods of diagnosis, it's largely a diagnosis by elimination. So it's normally repeated blood tests over a long period of time. And with ME, because there are no current biomarkers that are used for diagnosis, essentially you're probably going to have, if you have it, your blood test will still show up as normal, which is incredibly frustrating. There's often also a course of antibiotics that is prescribed to try and eliminate, any potentially underlying bacterial infections that could be causing the symptoms. And if after a period of time and repeated testing, no solid information presents to explain the symptoms, you may be given a diagnosis of ME, but it entirely depends on the level of knowledge of your GP, as some GPs even now are still skeptical of the condition. I will share a little bit of a story from how I got diagnosed. So when I started to get really sick when I was 16, and I experienced 13 viral infections in the space of 1 year. So that meant that about once a month I was experiencing a viral infection that had symptoms that would be similar to flu or meningitis, so quite severely debilitating, even involving in some cases hospital visits. But even feeling as sick as I was, they could not find a cause as to why this was happening. I was housebound for around a quarter of that year, so about 25% of the time I couldn't really leave the house. I had to get a lot of help with daily living activities from my parents, which when you're 16, 17 is really not fun. But I got repeatedly tested by my GP, so they would give me blood tests on a regular basis, and essentially they couldn't find anything wrong with me, but they just told me to keep getting tested. It was only when I changed over to a different GP who very fortunately had actually written their thesis on ME. She took one look at what the other GP had done, one look at my blood test results, and said, I think you have ME and I'm going to refer you over to the ME clinic. And that was it from there. So I want to look quickly at the link with long COVID. So the reason, now I'm going to clarify this by saying that we cannot officially say that long COVID is ME, but it has been associated with ME because of the similarities in terms of development, with it being post-viral, and the symptoms of fatigue and post-exertional malaise. Now, this is also not the first time that this has happened. So in 2009, there was a study on patients recovering from SARS, which is another form of coronavirus similar to COVID-19, which is not as infectious as COVID-19, but it showed that 27% of patients showed symptoms of ME a year into their recovery from SARS, which is really quite striking. And the COVID recovery programs that are being used in the UK currently are very similar to the programs prescribed for ME management, so looking at things like pacing and activity management. I've just had a quick time check and I was hoping I would have time to show this video, but I am going to skip it just for time purposes. But it's a message basically from people with ME to those living with long COVID that is put out by ME Action, which I will link to at the end. And it's their Stop, Rest, Pace video. If you've got a few minutes, I'd recommend having a look at it. So coming on now to treatment and management of ME. So ME does not have a pharmacological cure. There is no medication out there that will cure the condition. Sometimes people do access medication to help treat various symptoms, but this does not mean that they do not experience symptoms of the condition. The main treatments that are recommended are lifestyle and activity based. So things like pacing. So pacing is a system of activity management and monitoring. So you use to monitor your activity, to work out where your limits are, and to gradually increase activity levels over time. The system, the therapy known as graded exercise therapy, or GET, is no longer recognized under the NICE guidelines. So that is the system where you are encouraged to exercise and to gradually increase exercise over time. It's actually been very harmful to people that have ME, and people in the ME community have been campaigning for years to have it removed from the treatment guidelines for ME. It was only actually removed last year. So in 2020, despite a long period of evidence of ME patients actually getting worse from undertaking graded exercise therapy. And I will clarify this by saying some treatments work for some people and not for others. You may find, some people don't get on, for example, with pacing. People have to do what is right for them. So I'm not advocating any particular type of treatment here. But generally, that's the only thing that is prescribed for people with ME, is these kind of activity management type treatments. And even that in itself can be difficult to access. So not all areas of the UK have an ME clinic, and some ME clinics will only treat mild or moderate cases, and they may not treat people with severe ME, just because it's much more difficult to start off that to do any activity at all when you have severe ME. So that kind of rounds up the first half. I will say I'm doing this in kind of two halves. So I'm talking generally first about the condition, just because it's really important to have that background understanding of what the condition is and what the stigma and the treatment and things like that, to understand the issues in terms of ME in employment. So I just want to put out there, does anybody have any questions about what we've covered so far in terms of the condition in general, the treatment, the stigma, the diagnosis?
We don't have any in the chat at the moment, but I will give it a moment to see if any.
Okay, no problem. And I always say the only thing you're not allowed to ask me is if I've tried yoga.
I think we're good. I think.
Okay, in that case, I'm going to move on. So we're going to talk now about ME in the workplace and also in employability, so job seeking and looking for work. I'm going to put this as a disclaimer first. Not everyone with ME can work. So when I'm talking about ME, it's not possible for everyone. Yeah, for people with more severe ME, it's not always possible to work. Some people with ME can work in some roles, but may require awareness and or adjustments from employers and other professionals. So what kind of roles can someone with ME do? So there are not necessarily set limits or restrictions. Physical roles obviously may be less likely because of the fatigue, the post-exertional malaise and the pain. They're not necessarily ruled out for people with mild ME. I have certainly spoken to and worked with people who have mild ME who do have more physical roles, and that's really a personal choice that they have to make, is what they feel comfortable with. Roles that can offer part-time, flexible working and home working just may be better suited because of that flexibility, and working from home is just super useful in terms of energy management. Obviously, that's something that we're all doing a lot more of these days. Sticking with roles that fit comfortably within the person's skill set can help with energy management. So I always like to say, if you think about, if you're doing something that you feel comfortable and confident with, and that you don't have to spend a lot of time learning about, that's going to maximize your energy and efficiency in terms of doing it. Whereas if you're asked to do something that you are less skilled at, you're going to take more time to do it, and you're also going to need more concentration to do it as well. So really working out what are the things that you can do really comfortably and confidently will actually potentially help with maximizing the energy output and just putting the focus on the things that you know that you can do really well. But there are no hard or fast rules. Each person has to work out what's kind of suitable for them. You know, I spend a lot of my time in my role talking to people and giving people information. And whilst that's certainly tiring, it's something that I feel really confident and comfortable with. Whereas if you asked me to do any kind of maths or anything really practical, that's where I'd really struggle. Whereas some people might find it the other way around. If they've got, say, better muscle memory, or maybe they experience less pain, they may actually feel more comfortable with that physical side of things. It really just depends on the person, their level of symptoms, and how they affect them. So my guidance for professionals who are supporting job seekers is to listen to people with ME and their needs. Hopefully today has given you just a little bit more insight into how difficult that can actually be, and what systems are at play in the lives of people with ME. Offering adjustments for appointments and activities can be really helpful. So things like breaking up activities into smaller chunks, or allowing people more time could really help. Continuing with remote support. So a lot of services have started remote support over the pandemic, and continuing that for people with ME or other energy limiting chronic illnesses could be beneficial. If you think about it, having to travel to an appointment, if you're dealing with those symptoms of fatigue and pain, that isn't necessarily as easy as it might be for a non-disabled person. So if you're able to offer that support without the travel element of it, it could mean that the person then has more energy to use in the appointment itself or in doing the job seeking activities. If someone with ME has a concern about a task or a role, you talk it through with them. Try and think about what sort of adjustments might be able to help them with doing the task, and think about the adjustments they might need. They might need to think about having a disability disclosure in place so that they can confidently explain their condition to an employer, as well as the adjustments that they would need in the workplace. And finally, is your client on the right benefits, and have they been assessed correctly? Now, this is really important, because if you're an employment professional, you might just be seeing someone, or somebody could be referred onto you purely because of the level of benefits that they are on. So my example is always, if you get someone who is on job seekers allowance as opposed to employment support allowance, there's obviously a level of activity that a person on job seekers is expected to undertake, which could be really challenging for people with ME. If they're finding the level of activity that's expected of them really difficult, would they perhaps be better off claiming employment support allowance instead? Now, bear in mind that if you are recommending this for anyone that you're working with, a lot of people with ME are really apprehensive about interacting with the DWP. If we think back to that kind of stigma and how people with ME are treated generally in the benefit system, a lot of people are not believed. People with ME on the whole do find it very difficult to access benefits, and also to get medical evidence for that as well. So they may be mistrustful, and they may need encouragement or perhaps support from other agencies to consider interacting with the DWP and changing their benefits. So we're going to move on to ME in the workplace and what can help. My three kind of basic principles of this are communication, planning, and reasonable adjustments are absolutely key, and access to work can obviously be a part of that if it's needed. So chronic illness in work communication. The key things here are having privacy, to feel comfortable to disclose that the person has a condition to a line manager or trusted colleague, and offering the support to disclose as needed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that everyone in the workplace needs to know. It's up to the person with ME to decide who they feel comfortable knowing about their condition. But they should be given support in disclosing to their colleagues if that's something that they decide to do, and getting those colleagues to understand perhaps why that person might need reasonable adjustments. Another important part of communication is setting expectations for every day. So for the employee with Emmy to know what is expected of them in the workplace, and also what they can expect if they're not feeling so great, or perhaps they are not able to meet those expectations for the day. What do they need to do? What's the kind of communication expectation if someone is having a good or a bad day? We'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in the planning section. There's also, in terms of setting up reasonable adjustments, there do need to be regular opportunities to communicate the person's needs and the suitability of adjustments. Obviously, Emmy is a fluctuating condition. It does change sometimes very rapidly, but it does also change over time as well. So a person will need to be able to communicate their needs as they change. On the basis of communication, I'm going to do a quick exercise, which I like to call, is it okay to say? And I'm going to ask Helen to help me here. She's going to bring up some polls on the screen. If you can't see the polls, I would just like you to put yes or no in the chat. So as a group, we're going to examine the following phrases, and I want you to tell me yes or no. There's also an I'm not sure option. Is it okay to say? So the first one is, but you don't look sick. So I want a yes, a no, or a not sure on is it okay to say. By the way, I'm not going to judge anyone on your answers here. It's okay.
And it's worth saying as well, all the polls are anonymised, so you can answer without fear of having your name called out alongside your answer. We've had 5% of people have voted, and so far we've got 93% of those have gone with no, with 1% going for I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah. So I am going to go with agree with the majority here in that yes, or rather no, you absolutely do not want to say to a person with ME, but you don't look sick. By the way, all of these are things that have been said to me in my life with chronic illness. The reason being told that you don't look sick, the reason that that is very frustrating is that essentially, even though you don't look sick, it doesn't mean that you don't feel sick, because it's an invisible condition. How you're presenting on the outside doesn't necessarily correlate with what's happening with your symptoms and how you feel on the inside. And it's really, really frustrating to be told by somebody that you don't look sick. There's also some other stuff about the general expectation of what disability looks like in our society. I won't go into that, that's a whole other issue, but it's just about thinking about the expectations of what disability looks like. So saying you don't look sick can be really, really unhelpful. Next poll, please.
Okay.
So you're feeling tired, drink some coffee.
Okay, so they're coming in.
Oh, they are. I can see them all. It's at the moment, it's all 100% no's. Yeah, so absolutely, we would say that this is not something that's okay to somebody to say to somebody with ME. The reason being is that it's not just tiredness, and also coffee doesn't help if you have fatigue. Coffee is not a thing that is, caffeine in general is not something that's going to be helpful. For me personally, caffeine actually makes my fatigue a lot worse. I've been known to drink a whole cup of coffee when I'm fatigued, and it will literally send me straight to sleep because it just completely overwhelms my nervous system. Next poll, please. I know how you feel. I hurt my back last week playing tennis.
Okay, so getting there lots of replies straight away.
I think you guys might have noticed a pattern here somehow.
Well, we've got 85% no, and this time they're changing all the time, but about 14% have said they're not sure. So I think here people are thinking from the point of view of trying to demonstrate some empathy, aren't they? But,
they are, absolutely. This is not something I would necessarily recommend saying to a person with ME. So first of all, I know how you feel means that you're comparing your experience to theirs. You know, as a non-disabled person, that's really not okay. If you do have a chronic illness, you know, even if you do have a chronic illness, that can be a little bit tricky to say, because obviously everyone has a slightly different experience. But the fact that in this person's case, they hurt their back last week playing tennis, hurting your back through an injury is a temporary inconvenience. It does not compare to a long-term chronic illness and the management of that. You would find that somebody with a chronic condition gets treated in a very different way from someone who has injured themselves playing sport.
Okay, and that's quite interesting, because while I get the next one ready, we had a comment earlier around often it almost becomes a competition for who's the most tired when people complain about that energy impairment.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, I'm not going to say, obviously everyone experiences tiredness at some point in their lives, absolutely. And I've had a lot of comparisons from, you know, people who, for example, are parents and maybe have been kept up by small children, or even by noisy neighbors, or, you know, just people that have very busy lives. And certainly, you know, people with Emmy and other energy limiting chronic illnesses, when of course we recognize that other people are tired, but it's a very, very different thing to be tired and to experience this fatigue even when you've had 10, 12, 14 hours sleep. And often, you know, this worsening symptoms with even minor activities, it's really very different. Yeah, next slide, next poll, please. How are you? How are you? Now, is this okay to say?
We've got lots of yeses coming through now. We're at about 50% of people have voted. We're nearly at full. So we've got a not sure. So 93% of people have said not sure, and 7% just adjusted a little bit, have said I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if you know that somebody is struggling with their health, it can feel a little bit tentative as to whether you should actually ask how they're doing. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't be asking people how they are. Of course, you should ask people how they are. It's a very, very human thing to do. We want to know, you know, we want to know how people are. We want to demonstrate genuine empathy as well. So I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Absolutely. Just be prepared that for some people with ME or other chronic illnesses, it can be a really difficult one to answer. The reason I include this one is because there was a time early in my diagnosis and in terms of learning to live with my condition where this question used to send me into floods of tears, because I literally did not know how to answer it, whether to be honest with people, whether to, sometimes if you share the reality of what's going on with you, people think, oh goodness, I didn't want that much information. Oh, that sounds awful. And then they kind of shut it down and they're not going to ask you that question again. So just be prepared that you might not necessarily get a positive or an upbeat or a chipper reaction. And people who have chronic illnesses are allowed to be honest about their condition. They're allowed to be realistic, and sometimes that is going to be negative, and that's okay. The main thing is you need to listen to that person and empathize with them. Okay, so yeah, I can totally understand the one person that said not sure. I can totally understand where that comes from, but yeah, I'm not going to tell people that it's not a thing you should be asking. Next poll. So my cousin had that. They got cured with acupuncture. You should absolutely do that.
Okay.
So we've got the no's. Yeah. The no's are racking up here.
I think we're going to have a okay. Oh no, we've got a not sure as well.
Got a not sure. Okay. Yep.
And I think that's fair enough. Again, I wonder there, it's around where the comment is coming from, isn't it? Maybe trying to give helpful advice.
Yeah, and this is something that is a very, very common experience, is people hearing about your circumstances, associating it with the one other person they know who's had the condition or had something similar, and saying, oh, brilliant, this worked for this person, it would totally work for you. And that's not the case. First of all, as we know earlier, there are no cures for ME. There is nothing that treats the condition itself, only symptoms. So really fantastic that worked for that one person that you know. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for somebody else. I can also guarantee that we have absolutely heard that suggestion before. And, you know, everyone should be able to make the decisions about what they do try in terms of treatment of their condition. And finally, I mean, just quite frankly, with acupuncture, but with a lot of different things that are suggested for people with ME, the science isn't necessarily there to back it up. If you do feel like you want to tell somebody with ME or any other chronic condition something, maybe just have a look at where the science is coming from, or if there's even valid studies that back things up, and also check if they're open to receiving the information before you tell them. Final poll, please. My absolute
This is
favorite.
a trick one, isn't it, Alice? You're trying to get us in trouble. We know what we should answer to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've got a couple of no's so far, and I've already stated it in my question. Oh, so we've got a yes, actually. That's an unusual. We've got one yes, and we've got one I'm not sure.
I think people are maybe thinking that they're wondering whether they can pull your leg here.
People are trying to get away with asking me if I've tried yoga, aren't they? So yeah, it's one of those things where yoga is very good for a lot of people, and it's not harmful, whereas some of the other treatments and alternative therapies that are sometimes suggested for ME could potentially be harmful. Obviously, yoga in some cases could be harmful if somebody is pushing themselves to do that level of exercise. It could actually be potentially harmful for them. But because people tend to think of it as being quite innocuous and quite safe, it is a really common suggestion. More than anything, quite frankly, it's just annoying. It's honestly something I've heard so many times. And as a person with ME who practices yoga, I can tell you that although it's lovely and relaxing and helps with, your stresses and anxiety, it certainly does not alleviate the physical symptoms of yoga.
I find yoga relaxing. Yoga's really hard, I think, whenever I do it. And I always think I should be relaxing. This is supposed to be
it depends on the it depends on the type of yoga. Me personally, I can only ever cope with the kind of the restorative yoga, so the stuff that is meant to be more relaxing. But thank you for indulging me in those polls. As I said, I was trying to lead people or trying to demonstrate particular answers and things not to say with that. I'm just going to skip through these quickly. So let's talk about what is helpful with communication in terms of ME. So try to use neutral language to describe a person and their experience. So using language like a person has ME, a person experienced ME. Try to not use negative language, so feels like things like suffers or endures ME. Again, as we've seen, please don't offer us advice. If there's something that you would really like us to know about, again, do a bit of your own research first to see if the science is there to back it up, and then maybe just check in with us first to see if we are open to receiving a suggestion, and don't take offense if actually we don't want to hear it. Don't compare our experience to yours or anyone else's. Again, we know that everyone experiences tiredness, everyone experiences pain at some point in their life, and people with ME are not saying that they don't believe anyone else's pain, but just don't compare it, because you honestly don't know what the experience is like. Your language demonstrates whether or not you believe us, so use it to show that you do empathize with us. You don't have to have the answers, but even just telling us that we're sorry you're going through that, or that sounds really challenging, means that you do believe us and that you're not questioning our experiences. And it is okay if you don't get it right 100% of the time, but do be prepared to correct yourself and listen to us if we tell you that we're not happy with something that you've said. We're going to come now on to planning, and this is really important because of the fluctuating nature of ME. Planning for good days and bad days is essential. So in the workplace, on a good day, someone with ME may want to engage in more work or more activities because they know that they're not going to feel in a good place for a long time. So they may want to get the most out of that good period. Whereas on a bad day, a person with ME may have difficulty with mobility, energy, concentration, memory, or communication. So you might need to consider having a bad day plan to take these aspects into account, to outline what adjustments may be needed on bad days? Is it that a person needs to have their duties adjusted on a bad day? Is it that they might need to communicate with you in a slightly different way? For example, communicating by email if they're finding phone or meetings very difficult. And even if an employee with ME cannot work on a bad day, you still might need to make a plan. So, for example, do they need changes made to the sickness reporting policy if they find it difficult to communicate verbally? Do they need to maybe email or text you? Or do you need to have adjustments made to the sickness absence plan? Because, of course, someone with a chronic illness may be more likely to have more sickness absences. So you need to make a plan so that person is not unfairly disadvantaged by their condition. And also, does a plan need to be made for that person's workload? In all honesty, being off work for me is one of the most painful things. I absolutely hate being off work. And it can get really upsetting, but I know that there is a system in place whereby the work that I'm not able to do can be covered by my colleagues. And that is really reassuring for me, because it means I can take the time I need to rest, recover, recuperate, and go back to work feeling healthy, rather than forcing myself to go back to work before I feel ready to do so. I'm going to talk really quickly about reasonable adjustments. So I don't want to go over anything too obvious, but obviously reasonable adjustments are generally covered under the Equality Act, and they are provision by which employees can meet the needs of those who have a disability. So some of the kind of adjustments that might be helpful for people with ME could include equipment or technology, so using things like dictation software or dictation features. I don't know if anyone has seen the Microsoft 365 update on the dictation feature, which is now present in all of their applications. So Word, Outlook, PowerPoint, they have this really great dictation feature that I've been using now for a couple of weeks. It is saving so much energy for me in terms of what I'm writing. Some people with ME find it really difficult to process visual information, and particularly things with white backgrounds can be really challenging because they reflect more light. So changes to background and text colors can be really helpful. That is actually a built-in setting within Windows Ease of Access settings. It can also be accessed on a Mac as well. Equipment to work in different positions, such as ergonomic chairs, sit-stand desks, ergonomic keyboards and mice can sometimes be helpful, as well as noise-cancelling headphones to help with concentration. In terms of environmental, working from home is obviously a really big one. Again, just because it helps save that energy for doing the work tasks rather than using your energy for actually traveling into the workplace. If a person does have to go into work, it can be useful to have a quiet space within the place of work for people to take proper rest breaks, and also, again, good lighting control, because a lot of people with ME can really struggle with bright lights. Practical support could also be helpful, so that could include having a support worker to assist with particular work tasks, access to work for travel support. Again, that can be, even if a person can use public transport or even drive, it's a use of energy, and if someone can actually be supported through taxis to get to and from the place of work, it can be an energy saver, so they can focus that energy on their work tasks instead. And this is really the biggest one for me, is those attitudinal adjustments. So awareness and understanding from colleagues is really, really key, particularly around adjustments that might need to be in place, particularly around adjustments to duties. A lot of colleagues can sometimes find that really difficult to understand. So having a better understanding and awareness of the condition can really help with that in the workplace. Changes to duties, role, hours, and working practice. So again, this would be things like adjustments to sickness reporting policies or even sickness absence policies. One of the things I found really stressful in the first couple of years of my diagnosis was when I would come back to work and be instantly disciplined by employers just for being off sick, and that being a thing that I couldn't control. So it's really, really vital that people with ME and other chronic conditions are not discriminated against in that way. And potential for reallocation of duties as well is another big one. just really quickly want to cover the options when working isn't working. As we said earlier, not everyone with ME can work, and in some cases it may not be possible for long-term chronically ill people to remain in work. So, you know, the adjustments we're looking at are about hopefully creating a more sustainable employment for people. But when those kind of options don't work, then the other options might have to be fully explored. Some people could benefit from a reduction in hours, flexible working, home working, or even an alternative role that could enable them to remain in employment. In some cases, if there is a possibility of condition improvement, perhaps the person is about to enter into a treatment or a management program for their condition, they might want to consider a sabbatical or a career break while that takes place. And if all of those, only after all of those things have been tried or explored, then ending the person's employment via retirement, redundancy, or capability dismissal should be explored, but that should absolutely be the last option. But always ensure that the person has sought advice about suitable disability benefits and pensions in the event that they're ending their employment. Sometimes people may have assumptions about what they will be entitled to, and it's really best that they check that to make sure that they know that they've got a suitable amount of income coming in if they can no longer remain in employment. So, I hopefully, obviously I'm just really conscious of time, and I've tried to get as much information into this hour as I can without making it too hard for yourselves. But has anybody got any questions they want to pose for me, you know, either on what we've covered as an employment advisor or as someone with ME? You want to put them in the chat.
Okay, we're just waiting to see if anyone has any questions. There was a question that came earlier, but another person, I believe, answered it, and that was around someone being referred to rheumatology for assessment, and was that the right approach to take?
It really depends on what has come up on their tests. There are kind of different diagnostic criteria for services like rheumatology, and some GPs might sort of try a referral to rheumatology if they're not really sure what else to do. So it's not necessarily incorrect. It could be part of a diagnostic process being referred into a particular service. I'm just going to add, if any, I mean, I don't know if questions are coming in. If you haven't got any, if people haven't got questions, maybe just put in the chat, you know, what have you got from today's session and how will you action it? Is another thing that would be good to know.
We have some comments, and more great session, really informative, and thank you. Julie has said, no questions, just really want to thank you for everything you've shared. It definitely helped me at work and be able to appropriately inform participants I deliver training to who suffer from the same condition. Great feedback. Sally says, thank you so much for a great session, very informative.
Oh, thank you, everyone. That's really kind. Yeah, I'm really sad I haven't been able to look at the chat. This has been the first time I've presented something in this way. So it's been really weird for me actually not being able to interact with people in that way. But I'm really glad that people have got things from it. If anyone has any specifics about what they feel that they've got from it or what they want to action, please do drop that in the chat. If you want to know more, so you can visit my website, which is chronicallyconsulting.co.uk. So that's training and consultancy specializing in chronic illness and employment. I do kind of longer training sessions on chronic illness specifically in the workplace, and that obviously goes into more depth. I'm also hoping to develop something as like an awareness sessions for colleagues as well. So, you know, find me on the website and you can contact me from there if you have any questions or would like to know more.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've had a question come in around, Helen has read that treatment in the US is stimulant medication. Are you aware of that, Alice?
Sorry, Helen, you broke up a little bit there. What medication?
Stimulant medication.
Okay, so what I'm going to go back to is what is the science behind this? There is a lot of research happening into ME, and you know, in terms of what could help with testing it and also what could help with treating it. And I'm not, have to say, I'm not aware of the use of stimulants in the US as a form of treatment, and I really wouldn't want to comment on it without actually reading what the science behind it is. So I would kind of go back to that, is actually looking at what is happening with it, what's the research, where's that information coming from, and also who's funding that research as well, because in some cases it might be that the people who are making the stimulants could be funding or producing that.
Yes, interesting. That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've had a comment from Julie saying, I'll take away the point about breaking my work into chunks and incorporate that into my way of working.
Oh, thank you, Julie. That's really fantastic. Another thing I will say, so I do individual consulting with people as well as with businesses and employers. So, you know, if anybody is perhaps working with someone who might benefit from having an individual one-to-one session with, you know, someone who understands the issues they may be facing and can give advice and help make a plan, please do get in touch with me. I just want to also outline some of the further support organisations or further reading that you might find helpful. So there are a few Emmy organisations in the UK. Action for ME, they provide information, support and advocacy for people with ME. There's also the Emmy Association, which is a bit more focused on medical research, but they do have a telephone helpline and they run support groups. Emmy Action, who I had the video earlier from, but I didn't share it, but they are a global grassroots organisation focused on raising awareness and campaigning. They're also the organisers of the Millions Missing protests. Essentially, I don't know if anybody has seen those. It's the protests and the marches where, because of course a lot of people with ME, because of its energy limiting and fatigue effects, protests are very difficult to attend for people with ME. So they do things like they will just put out a pair of their shoes with a sign on it, you know, with information about them to say why they're missing from that protest, which can be really powerful when you think about those 250,000 people in the UK alone who've been affected by the condition and are essentially missing from society. And as I mentioned earlier, the fantastic Chronic Illness Inclusion Project, their report on energy limiting chronic illnesses, which is I already have a job getting through the day, that was recently published and is very reflective of not just the experiences of people with ME in terms of accessing the workplace and the benefit system, but other energy limiting chronic illnesses as well. And I want to thank Catherine for all of the fabulous work that she does on that. Also,
excellent.
just
thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to leave this up on the screen, but I will exit that for now. I'll just leave this up obviously for all of the sources that I have used today. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been able to attend and to listen, and for your lovely comments as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Alice. As I've said, I have put it in the chat, but this session will be available via the YouTube channel, the IEP YouTube channel. So there's lots of information there, and that's fantastic. So people will be able to go and revisit and reflect and yeah, take in some more information, because it's been a fantastic information giving session. Just to let you all know, if next week's session is brought to us by Practice Labs, and the title of it is Solving the Digital Skills Gap Through Practice. And what we're looking at is having the foundation of digital skills now being essential in gaining work and operating successfully in society. Practice Labs founder Ricky Doyle will take us through a journey of why we need to start to think differently on building employability skills and how to put digital at the forefront of your employment toolkit. So that sounds fascinating. So it's a great one, very different to this week's. Thank you again, Alice. I've really enjoyed it and found it very enlightening. So thank you very much personally. Thank you to everyone who has attended, and I hope to see you all again on future sessions. So thank you for that.
Thanks for having me, Helen. It's been great.